Okay, well, thank you for coming back. Uh, Now I'm going to get into some specifics of the larger picture I presented yesterday. And I'm going to continue the same ecological approach and then show through the emergence of creoles and pigeons what role particular ecologies played in the emergence of these particular varieties. And I use the same ecological approach to also the same ecological approach to show why pigeons didn't, why I think they emerged rather late and probably after creoles. And thereby I proceed to argue that pigeons should not be considered as the ancestors of creoles. And in a way, creoles and pigeons developed in similar ways, but in different places, where the natures of interactions were different. And pigeons emerged as lingua franca, whereas creoles emerged as vernaculars for day-to-day communication. But the other thing that I will have to underscore is that typically creoles and pigeons started from closer approximations of the lexifier. The lexifier is the language from which most of the vocabulary has emerged. And if you pay attention, much of the grammar too comes from the lexifier, although we must recognize substrate influence. It can be more significant in some places than in others, and we can always come up with some ecological explanation for this variation. And the title includes the words food and sex. It's not that I'm going to talk so much about these things, but I want to underscore the social dimension of contacts between Europeans and non-Europeans in the emergence of creoles. And in order to talk about these contacts, it will be necessary to articulate the need for food, the need for goods, and for the men that were participated in these expeditions, the need for sex. Okay, and what kinds of relations they establish between people. Okay. According to the traditional narrative in linguistics, pigeons are considered as broken languages, at least at the incipient stage, completely broken. And they emerged out of sporadic contacts between European traders and indigenous populations outside Europe between the 15th and the 19th centuries. And I'm going to say the history that I have read, written especially by economic historians, doesn't suggest this scenario. Okay. And there was no period when the language was, the European language or the lexifying language was really broken. I have to clarify, I'm going to talk especially on creoles and pigeons that have been lexified by European languages. I will not talk about other varieties that have also been called creoles or pigeons, because I don't think that there is any particular structural justification for extending the term just like that at the will of some linguists as creole or pigeon. Okay. And one of the reasons behind the narrative that we have received today is Europeans presumably were not interested in learning the languages of the the non-European populations, which they considered less evolved than themselves, okay. Or even the trade partners, because for Europeans in the 19th century, non-European languages were less evolved than European languages. And the reason was supposedly the mental inferiority and sometimes the anatomical inferiority, so they of these non-Europeans that they were interacting with. So, because of differences in economic power, the non-Europeans learned the European languages, but not well. Either because they had too limited exposure to the European languages, since the European populations were not permanent outside Europe in the trade force, or perhaps because, as the Europeans thought, the non-Europeans were too less evolved mentally um, and were mentally inferior, and they couldn't master the sophisticated European languages. And it's usually a kind of biased comparison because they take the vernacular varieties of the non-Europeans and compare them to the standard varieties of European languages. And it was sloppy scholarship because they didn't want to recognize that, I mean, the scholars of that time, most of them philologists, didn't want to recognize that a lot of the Europeans, if not most of them, that were involved in the trade and in the colonization of the world came from the lowest strata of the European populations and were not speakers of standard varieties of European languages either. And this is what we have to recognize. And this is the map that I projected yesterday. I explained it, and I'm going to justify this map today as we go. So a lot of the explanation that I'm going to give will help us understand why this map is this way, that we find Creoles typically in plantation settlement colonies where non-European populations were the dominant, the overwhelming majority, and where segregation was implemented rather early in the development of the colonies. Whereas Pidgins, we can say, well, they really evolved in trade colonies, but that's the traditional view. The view that I'm going to give is somewhat different because we have different ways of explaining why Pidgins emerged and why they didn't emerge as early as we have assumed, and why I think that they emerged by what in creolistics we call basilictalization. That is, gradual diversions farther and farther away from structures of the lexicon. This becomes kind of tricky because when we say basilictalization in terms of divergence farther and farther away from the lexifier, we are still comparing the Pidgins and Creole to the standard varieties of European languages. The picture is really different when you make the comparison with the non-standard varieties. And all we can say, just as in the case of Latin in Europe, especially Western Europe, that it is just divergence from structures of the lexicon. And whether we should characterize this in terms of basilictalization is problematic. If when Emno Capo comes, he probably will talk about this. He's been discouraging me from using the term basilictalization, and I think he's right. Yeah. A more neutral term is just divergence. Okay. And then there is this complementary opposition, this complementary distribution of the varieties called Pidgins and the varieties called Creoles. And in Hawaii, we get this complementary distribution in ways that we don't see elsewhere, where the Creole actually emerged in the city, whereas elsewhere Creoles developed on plantations. And but pigeon emerged on the plantations. Okay, that's not the process. But pigeon emerged on the plantations in Hawaii, whereas elsewhere, where Creoles emerged, you cannot find a pigeon that emerged at the same time. Okay, or that emerged before that. This is not to deny that whenever there is contact between populations, the learners go through an interlanguage, but they don't get stuck in the interlanguage. They move to closer approximations of the lexified. Albeit non-native approximations, we are not going to deny it. And if we deny it, we would have no business talking about Creoles in the first place. Okay. But we are not going to say that the people were stuck in the interlanguage stage either. Okay. So what I want to show is that this really was the conditions under which both Creoles and Pidgins emerge and have evolved are similar to those that we can observe in some places today when populations learn another language and go through an interlanguage and eventually they wind up speaking the language at a level that heritage speakers can consider acceptable. Okay, but that is also a matter of point of view. Like, do I speak perfect English or do I speak a sloppy approximation of English? So it depends on who judges. Okay. And so, yeah. One also gets the wrong impression that there were bazaar-style markets where anybody could trade the commodities that both parties were involved. You get the impression that, some Europeans got on the canoes or whatever, showed up on the coast of Africa, and do you have slaves for me? I can buy. That didn't exist. And the point I'm going to make is the Europeans merchants, they consisted of companies. When we read history, that's why we hear Dutch East India Company, British East India Company, French East India Company, or French Africa Company, and all these things, or English West Indies Company, or English Virginia Company. This is real, it was business. Yesterday I made allusions to Microsoft and four companies and so forth. You have to think of it that way. And at the destination, there were trading partners, and you have to think, which human being has enough power to sell another human being? Not just anybody. Even for members of your family, if you did, there are some sorts of laws in the village or wherever that can sanction these kinds of transactions. This is what we have to keep in mind. Which individual is likely to sell tons of ivory? Which individuals is likely to sell, tons of gum and things like that, so that other people can make money. So we have to think of this market not in the style of bazaars, but in the style, if you are not familiar with bazaars, think of malls today, where you can go and you walk around and you can determine what you buy where and so forth. Those markets, kinds of markets will exist. But if you think of the trade here in terms of powerful people in Africa and Asia selling expensive commodities, including tea that was an expensive commodity, to another company bringing goods from Europe unfortunately, usually junk technology that Europeans were getting rid of, then you can see what really was going on here. And if you consider the value of the commodities, only a fool would engage in this kind of trade in a broken language. So there was no room for peace. Okay. And the other thing that you have to bear in mind, there has usually been a lag between the time of the arrival of of Europeans on some um, uh, shore of Africa or Asia and the time when trade would begin. There must be practical reasons. You first of all you have to determine what goods you are going to trade, okay, and the feasibility of the trade. Whether you can establish good communication so that you can, establish the values of the commodities and so forth and so forth. Yet, of course, people cheated too, and Europeans took serious advantage of non-Europeans in some cases. But by the time you get to China, you find out that the Chinese had already been trading long distance way before the Europeans arrived there. And they were trading in Southeast Asia and South Asia, and some speculated the Chinese may have come as far as Somalia, but I think most probably they stopped around India, I don't know. But they had a lot of experience. And the Chinese merchants had formed guilds. And when you read the history of the trade for the British East India Company with China, you realize that Europeans faced particular challenges in negotiating with the guilds. And Europeans were not allowed to get involved directly in the negotiations. The Chinese said, you had brokers, you go through our brokers. And same thing that goes on with Microsoft and with Ford Motor Company and things like that when they are engaged in international trade. Okay. And the society, the multilingual natives had to solve the communication problem among themselves. That's what we have always said. That teachings emerged because, first of all, non-Europeans had to learn the European languages under conditions of sporadic contact between Europeans and non-Europeans. And even if Europeans could learn African languages or Asian languages, there were too many of them. So it was just easy for them to impose the European language. This is not really what happened. Although we have to explain why in Africa and Asia, it's a European language that prevails as the language of trade, whereas here in the Americas, it's indigenous languages that were originally used as the language of trade. Okay, like Tupi here in Brazil and so forth. Why wasn't it Portuguese? Portuguese becomes an important language later. And actually the Portuguese were penetrating the interior following the routes that indigenous traders had been using before them. So this is particularly important. Okay. So in green there you see question that we have to answer, could just any native in the trade colonies engaged in trade with Europeans? The answer is no. And when it comes to the slave trade, I believe a lot of natives were trying to run away from the Europeans rather than coming close to them. And how the Europeans were getting the slave, the enslaved people, the captives, there's something else that we have to explain. Who were the trade partners? I have explained that already. Mercantile companies in Europe, they sent representatives to conduct the trade, not the owners of the companies themselves. And in Africa, there were rulers, but it's not the rulers that interacted directly with uh, the representatives of the mercantile companies. It was interpreters that did the job. And when you study the history of a lot of kingdoms, there have usually been individuals in the court that function as interpreters, not necessarily for Europeans, because with Africa being so multilingual, there must have been a number of people that had needed interpreters to talk to the ruler. Okay. And you hear jokes, for instance, about whether what was said was translated faithfully, because it may have been said in an offensive way and the interpreter has to polish it up. Or the interpreter, like a speaker, said it in such a stupid way, funny way, that the case could have been resolved and so forth. So these are important things to take into account. In other words, there were these, they are also identified in some cases as masters of languages. In other, and the terms that you find in literature go between intermediaries, interpreters, and even the term linguists. And I think here, in Portuguese, they identify as lingua. The people that can speak the other language. Okay, and were these new contact settings conducive to the emergence of pigeons early in the history of contacts? No. Did trade start concurrently with the initial contacts? The answer is also no. Think of it like the exploration of space now, How long will it take before the exploration of space becomes economically productive and useful? People are investing for the future. People are hoping that they can really benefit from this. And this is what was going on too. Of course, it will not take another 100 years or so, but you have to allow a span of probably 10 years or 20 years before real trade really started. By then, as I will show, there were children that were locally born, and they learn the language of the father, and they learn the language of the environment in which they grew up, that some of the heritage language, and they could act as interpreters. But I'm also going to show that the same ships that took the explorers or the merchants to different parts of the world, they carried individuals that were kicked out of Portugal and Spain through the Reconquista. And those people spoke Portuguese or Spanish. For Africa, Portuguese is very important because I'm going to show it in a short while why this was very important. And these people learned the indigenous languages by immersion because they sought protection from the local rulers and they entered unions with local women and so forth. And so if you don't think of the trade between Europeans and Africans or Asians in the style of bazaars, but in the way of a powerhouse versus another powerhouse or with another powerhouse, then you can see why a small numbers of people could have played a very important role in the trade associated eventually with slavery. So in the 15th century, toward the end of the Reconquista, actually at the end of the Reconquista for Spain, there were two European major maritime powers. Portugal earlier, with Henry the Navigator funding a lot of the expeditions, and then Spain starting in 1492. And competition between Portugal and Spain led certain ports to enact treaties separating the world into two halves, the world outside Europe. And the line went from the west of Cape Verde through the middle, not taking the whole Brazil, but the middle of Brazil today, so the eastern part was allocated to Portugal. And the Portuguese had control of all the territory until from the line to Indonesia and later on up to China, where the Spanish got the western side, which explains why most of the colonies in the Latin America are Spanish colonies, and they sail west all the way to the Philippines and belong to them. So this is nominal. And the rest of the story is that 150 years later or so, France, Holland, and England, not the UK, just England, wanted a piece of the pie and engaged in colonial ventures too. And that led them to confiscate from the Spaniards and from the Portuguese a lot of territories that they were claiming. Okay. So a treaty that you must remember is that of Tordesillas in 1494, where, and then it was revised a couple of other times by other courts, but this is what we have to remember. The other thing that we have to bear in mind, Africa had not been completely isolated from the rest of the world before the Portuguese initially discovered it. Actually, the Portuguese had heard about Africa, and the Portuguese were familiar with some populations of darker complexion that they had bought as slaves from the Arabs that were trading with. Okay. And this map shows that trade in Africa was organized mostly internally and not with the outside world. The outside world through the Arabs, but otherwise there were a lot of expedition trade routes within Africa. Okay. And we can understand why eventually there would be Africans in Portugal before the Portuguese went to explore new routes toward the Far East by sailing around Africa. So these are, again, other things that we have to get in mind. And there you see the different expeditions that eventually led to the Portuguese getting trade fortifications along the coast of Africa and South Asia, and then all the way to China. And I talked a little bit about this yesterday, and I'm going to come back to that again later. And so Africa goes through changes from mostly internal trade networks now to external trade networks. So from lack of interest in the sea to more interest in the sea, because that's where they were going to get commodities coming from Europe, but also commodities coming from Asia. If you think of this in terms of globalization, globalization didn't start with the collapse of the Iron Curtain. Globalization has been part of human history since the beginning of agriculture, when some populations produce so much agricultural products that they had to trade it with other populations far away to get different kinds of commodities that they desire and so forth. And so from agriculture to today, globalization has changed in complexity and in terms of the parts of the world that are involved. And as far as the beginning of the early modern times are concerned, Africa found itself at the center of the global trade because there were commodities. So you have to change the map also.
This one? Oh.
Next map, next slide, yeah, and next one too. Yeah. There were commodities coming from India, including cotton and stuff, that were traded with Africans when Europeans did it with oil. And then going back to Africa, they took whatever they needed. I'll give you the list of commodities in a short while to Europe. And then going back to Asia, there would be goods from Europe and sold in Africa, and got goods in Africa that people in Asia wanted and took them there. So this was the nature of trade. So if you say colonization, I'm sorry, globalization has changed, yes, globalization has changed because now Africa is on the periphery of globalization. It has become less important, in part because the trade routes are no longer dependent on seaways. The trade routes can also be done by airplanes, and Africa can be skipped. And that is what we find. And then eventually, we can change it again. We get to what had changed it, please. You get to where we can talk of triangular trade, because as that trade becomes so lucrative, especially in terms of human commodities, there are ships that come from Europe to Africa. They get commodities that they take to the Americas, and then from the Americas, commodities are taken to India. But I think a more reliable map is the one that I showed earlier. Can you go back? Yeah, where it's not just between Europe and the Americas and Africa, but it's also Asia. So things are much more complex than we can explain. But you have to see this just in the same way that we think of global trade networks today. And then you make a better sense of that. And then you can understand why it is so important to factor in brokers and interpreters, or call them in-betweens, or go-betweens, I'm sorry. Call them go-betweens or intermediaries. They are the ones that play an important role in communication. And later on, I'm going to say, when in the 19th century, the style of communication changes, and there is a shift from trade colonies to exploitation colonies. You shouldn't be surprised if I say Africa was colonized through interpreters. Asia too was colonized through interpreters. Unlike in the Americas or Australia, where with settlement colonies, the Europeans claim the new territories as their own. They dispossess the natives of their lands and marginalize them. And they instituted a system where you have to assimilate culturally to the colonizer if you want to operate in the new socio-economic world order. And when we put things this way, we can also explain the difference between the mentions of Creoles and the emergence of teachings, but at the same time show similarities in terms of how the restructuring process proceeded. Now we can move forward. Next slide again. Okay. And the reason why I assume this is that Africa was not as wild a land as people thought it was. There were kingdoms in Africa, there were empires. You see clusters of them. These are areas where different kingdoms or empires replaced each other. They didn't coexist like that in overlapping ways. It means that some of them started earlier than others and replaced them, but still they had to deal with Europeans. And you find them also here in Central Africa and in Ethiopia, that area and Ethiopia had been connected to the Middle East for the longest as before the history of Christianity, and it was makes sense. Now, the areas that are not circled, it does not mean that those areas of Africa were uninhabited. They were inhabited by the newly developed nation kingdoms. They had simpler systems of kingship, chieftainship, more or less like several small kingships or chieftainship that were typical of Iberia before the Roman Empire or before the colonization of Iberia by the Muslims. Okay, and that means also that because there were political institutions, the political institutions were protected by certain local laws. So no European could just come on the coast of Africa, hey, I show up here, please sell me one or two slaves, I need them. That didn't happen. Okay. And later on, I'm going to say there were fleets of ships coming together. And they were armed. And they had stockage of goods and food just to live for a while, but for the people that had to stay at the trade force, the story was different. They had to live there for sometimes 6 months. And what were they doing in terms of socialization? So here is a representation of the institutions. They had the courts and the like, and the kinds of goods that they traded. Europeans sold cotton from India to Africans, woolen textile also, iron bars and tools coming from Europe, copper coming from India, guns coming from Europe, jewelry coming from India, and alcohol coming from India or Europe, not India actually, from Europe. But it's not that Africans didn't produce alcohol, this was interest in new kinds of alcohol. And we see that today you have cachaça here in Brazil, but you can still import rum from Martinique or from Guatemala just for variety, and this happened. Okay, and Africa sold gold. That's why you have a city like a Mina that emerged on the coast, the mine. Okay, and these were gold mines. Africa sold ivory, Africa sold slave, Africa sold spices different from those that came from India. Africa sold carvings, but Africa sold palm oil, rubber, and groundnuts. And these products become particularly important at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, where you had to produce soap and other kinds of things with palm oil. Okay, and gum. I don't quite know what gum was used for, but it's listed among the commodities that were sold. Okay, and this is why I think the value of the commodities are so high that only a stupid guy would trade in a broken language. This is not like me going to a market where I can bargain on an individual level for something, but we're dealing with large quantities of these commodities, and it was not such a simple matter. Okay, so you have an illustration of the commodities there, but because there were institutions, political institutions, there were negotiations, and there were arrangements for some royal courts to send members of the royal entourage to Europe, either as ambassadors or to learn the European language, and after they had learned the European language, that they can come and serve as interpreters. Okay. And these are I have to navigate again this way. And these are the areas where there was the most trade on the coast, especially regarding slaves. And the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana, is where Elmina is and where people discover gold, and they would discover it in other places. And here, West Central Africa, which includes present-day Angola and part of the demographic the Republic of Congo, and then the Republic of Congo, and then Cabinda. Uh, so these are places that we have to remember. There were places on the East Coast too, but that comes a little bit later. Okay. So as I have said, no bazaars have been identified where multitudes of Africans traded with Europeans. This is not the case, but this is what we seem to have believed in linguistics. I don't know why. Um, and so the slave markets of the New World are different from the slave markets of Africa, because the companies that delivered the human captives in Africa, in the New World, they came and traded with plantation owners or some individuals with a lot of money that came to the market and chose the slave they wanted. But there were also systems where, as I have read, plantation owners commissioned um, for slaves to be brought, say, from Angola. And there were freight ships. And freighters took the people and brought them for the people that had ordered them. About how many years later, I don't know, but those people arrived. Okay, so it's that kind of market. But there were also markets where people could come and buy individual slaves, one or two, because the people didn't have enough money. So the market that existed in the New World is not the kind of market that existed in Africa. And what I wanted to highlight here, they came as fleets. Remember how Columbus discovered the Americas? Did Columbus, one story says Columbus came on his ship and the ship broke down and he had to fix it before sailing back. When you think about it, the story doesn't make sense. Because a ship, you need a whole big structure to lift it and work on it. And if Columbus had come with just with one ship and the ship was wrecked, he would have been stuck. Columbus came with, according to one narrative, 3, according to another narrative, 4, and one of them was wrecked near Haiti, and he went back with the 3. But why did he need so many ships? Because he needed fresh water for the voyage, he needed food for the voyage, he needed some guns in case his team, his crew was attacked and he could defend himself. And this actually can explain the large numbers of ships that participated in the Portuguese expeditions. And the Portuguese were going to sail through areas where the Arabs had prevailed as the primary traders. So they were going to get into networks where they were likely to have fights. And the Portuguese had the advantage of gunpowder and cannons to drive the Arabs away. Okay. So this is what we have to bear in mind. And then the other thing to bear in mind, if you see all the waves, and you are here, you may know the story about big waves and so forth, how, what they can do to ships. If you, these are ships, the caravan depended on wind power. So if you went against the wind during a part of the year, you were likely to have a lot of wrecks. And people had to stay in the coastal fortifications, waiting for the direction of the winds to change before they could sail in one direction or another. So this explains the idling times. Even if you had already bought as many commodities as you wanted, you still had to wait for appropriate time to sail safely to your destination. So what did you do during the idling time? You ran out of food, you had to get food locally. But the local politicians didn't allow foreigners to start farms for their own. They had to buy the goods from the natives. Okay. And then they needed alcohol, as I said yesterday, they needed women, and they formed unions with women. But the women were just not any woman. These were business women that took advantage of them too. So it was what people say in French, win-win situation for these particular parties. So this is how we have to think of this trade. And so if the women live on a regular basis with the men, why would the women be happy with the teaching rather than learn the whole thing? And didn't the Europeans that were there so lazy as not to learn any of the local languages? But the critical factor is the children that will become important agents of the trade. Because in the interior, the foreigners were discouraged, if not forbidden, to go into the interior. There were also other reasons, like with malaria in some areas, people found it wiser to stay on the coast rather than go into the interior. It's not by accident that the exploitation, colonization of Africa also starts in the 19th century, after the invention of the quinine to fight malaria. Okay. So I once visited a cemetery in Macau. And it was interesting how many people die at a young age, about 25, 30. A lot of women died while delivering babies because the health care conditions were poor and so forth. And so people took precautions to avoid the areas where the fatality rate, mortality rate would be quite high. So questions arise about linguistic communication. And the history that I'm telling forces us to periodize globalization in order to answer some of the relevant questions. And one of them is, in what language did the initial interactions take place, especially when the Portuguese arrived? The Portuguese had black slaves that they purchased from the Arabs and the Moors, that is in Portugal, before sailing along. And when they went to Africa, they thought that it might work to buy the freedom of some of these slaves. And then the slaves would be speaking African languages. What they did anticipate is the multitude of languages in Africa, and the fact that the foreign slaves they took with them didn't necessarily come from the same regions. That's fair. So one way or another, they really had to wait. On the other hand, what we know is that the Europeans often took with them, and here the Portuguese, indigenous, hoping that by immersion in Portugal, they would learn Portuguese, and when they come back to the same places where they originated, they could act as interpreters. And of course, we have to factor in the children that were born, not during the first encounter, because those were difficult, but later on, whatever happened. And we have to factor in, as I told you earlier, people escaping the Reconquista and the Inquisition. And we went to Africa and decided to stay there. And some of them came to Brazil too. The first feitores, as we call them in Portuguese, the factors or traders, they consisted of people like them who had escaped and then came and started business here. So these are things that we have to remember. And when you come to another country and you put yourself more or less in the position of a refugee, and you are isolated, you learn the local language by immersion. Okay. And very often people even facilitated encounters between them and local women, because these were mostly males. And they learned the local languages, and they spoke Portuguese already. So what comes next? Is when the Portuguese come back and want to engage in negotiations with the local rulers, there were these guys that were available there. The toughest question is how communication proceeded in the very beginning. And that question we cannot answer yet. We just know the outcome, that there were interpreters that emerged in these particular kinds of settings, and they became quite useful. Okay, so realistically, we have to assume that the days of the onset of trade didn't coincide with those of the first encounters. It's just realistic. You have to know the ecology in which you are going to trade, what languages are spoken, what language you can use, who can serve as an interpreter, and so forth. So, the colonization of the world by Castile and Portugal occurred at the tail end of the Reconquista and the Inquisition in Iberia. This led to the presence of escapees and self-exiles known respectively as lanzados and tango-maos. Okay, as Portuguese speakers, you probably know this perhaps better than I can. Okay. But these are the people that went and got the protection of African rulers and married African women and had children with the African women, and they contributed to the production of interpreters. While they themselves also took advantage of the situation to make money and operated as interpreters. After all, they were rebuilding their lives after escaping the Inquisition and the Reconquista. They were connected not only with indigenous rulers, but also with local people identified as señoras and the mestizos children, both of whom learned their partners and fathers' language, as well as who met indigenous helpers who also helped in the trade, especially in the interior. And in the interior, there were also traditional traders known as pomberos. And the pomberos were just too eager to learn the trading partners' language. How they do it, I don't know, but they may have had their own interpreters. But I can identify these categories of people just to say the people that were multilingual or bilingual in a European language and an African language were few in number. And they played a very critical role. And they are also later on the people that will work in their own interest rather than in the interest of African rulers, and convince African rulers that they could form partnerships with Europeans in ruling Africa, and little by little, Europeans would gain the control of Africa in the 19th century, thanks to the progress, and eventually compete among themselves, and we know about African struggle. And this was settled at the Treaty of Berlin, at the end of the treaty in 1885. And then Africa would be divided among the different European nations. There are no mentions of pigeons in the factories associated with the trade. So we know of Gore and Nina, while there are references to interactions in several European languages in these places, they became cosmopolitan centers in which people could interact in several languages, and they were people also needed interpreters for their transactions if they didn't speak the local languages or their partner's language. So Pidgin, as a broken language, does not appear to have been an option, given the economic value of the commodities, nor could just anybody be involved in the trade I explained there. And Portuguese, not Pidgin Portuguese, appears to have been the trade language till the late 18th century. I don't know if you know Constance Jungblut, German linguist, who works on the history of Portuguese on the coast of Africa, and she calls it coastal Portuguese that was spoken. And according to her, that Portuguese was not broken language. It was just an indigenized variety of Portuguese. Okay. And we also see that African kings became interested in Portuguese. In the case of the Congo, there's a king, Don Alfonso of the Congo, who learned Portuguese in order to communicate with his brother, between quotation marks, in Portugal, and in order to communicate with the Pope. Okay. And Portuguese remained an important trade lingua franca in modern-day Benin, then called Dahomey, till the late 19th century, when the French colonized it on the exploitation model. And it's also striking when you read about pigeons lexified by European languages, you typically see English pigeons talked about, not French pigeons, not Portuguese pigeons, not Dutch pigeons, and you wonder what was going on. And we also have to underscore the absence of Dutch pigeons and the rarity of French pigeons. And anything that we call a French pigeon was either fabricated by the French colonial the French colonial army officers in the 19th century, or emerged in the 20th century from people who had learned very little French at school, but needed a lingua franca in urban centers to communicate with them among themselves. Next, please. Okay. So here you have an illustration of the Signal, and the Signal live in Western style, more or less. They adapted to the cultures that the European partners brought with them. Okay. And so they couldn't possibly be communicating in patience with their partners for that long. Okay. And some of them, these marriages were temporary. As long as the commercial partner lived there on the fork, could go to Europe and come back. But if they left, and many of them had wives in Europe, by the way, and when the men died or the man wouldn't come back, the marriage was annulled, and the woman could enter another marriage with another mercantile partner for economic reasons. For love maybe too, I don't know, but they really benefited from this trade between the European rulers and the Africans. And the children became very powerful. Some of the children even went to Europe to learn the father's language better if the father couldn't afford it, and then they came back and continued business, and they were really benefiting from it. Okay. So when you go to places like Senegal, don't be surprised by the high proportion of mulattoes in Senegal, whereas otherwise people are dark or as dark or darker than me. Okay, but then you have this class, and they are the descendants of of the unions from these unions between the women seigneurs and the Europeans. So, so there you get a plan of trade for divided into several things. The house of slaves, where the slaves were kept before they were shipped. There is a mosque. There is St. Charles Church, Christian Church, and they became sites of cultural encounters that were producing new forms of cultures where the European language could also play an important role. Can you move to the next slide? And then here you get an idea of what kinds of fortifications they were. They were really protected. And I'm trying to see, no. But when you visit these places, like you wonder what's the significance of all those windows. And usually at the top you have locations for cannons. Piracy was rampant at that time. People had to protect their fortifications from pirates, but also competition among European nations was very significant. There were a number of wars among European colonizers for the control of fortifications, and they had to really protect them. So these were universes that were becoming cosmopolitan, where there were people that were fluent in indigenous languages and in European languages. And if they were natives, like the children of the seigneurs, they could go to the interior and conduct the trade and come back with the commodities and help the Europeans take them out. Okay. Is it time for a break?
Yeah.
Maybe so. Let me just see what my next slide is. Ok, we have a break at this time.
Ok. Então, gente, vamos ter uma pausa agora, acho que mais ou menos 20 minutos.
And you have to remind me otherwise I can't speak. Somebody thought of me. It's not cold, but it's fine. But I don't finish out it. We go outside.
I'm going.
Oh, okay.
How are you?
I'm fine. How are you? I didn't do this far. I didn't do this far.
Really? Okay. I was.
You are right.
Yeah.
So you don't hear me well?
Sometimes when you turn.
Ah, okay.
So I think now it's better because you're.
Well, I think you should put me on that side because when I turn it will be closer.
Yeah, right.
This one.
Just to see if it's not going to.
You can turn a compressor to heat that.
So we can affirm that these individuals were already speakers of Portuguese as L2 before being brought to Brazil.
Okay. So now you hear super stronger. Okay. So what are the other relevant facts that have been ignored in the literature? Is the human social aspects of life while traveling. So we have to see this in terms of humans relocating themselves, going to places where they know different languages were spoken, and they have to adapt to these new language ecologies or language ecosystems. Okay. So they have to deal with the need for food. And because local rulers didn't allow European merchants or agents of the mercantile companies to grow their own food, the Europeans had to depend on food produced by the locals, which means some pressure at some point probably to learn a local language. Or if you have formed a union with a signar, then you depend on the staff that's used for the signar to produce the food. Okay. And there is dependence on local practices. You have to respect the local practices, and you violate them, you can be kicked out. And African rulers had that much power to do that kind of thing. So we can assume that the Europeans were really at the mercy of the local political institutions. Um, and so there's, on the human side, again, the social one, need for companionship while waiting for intermediaries to return from the interior. Because in the interior, it's the intermediaries that conducted the trade. And that trade in the interior was not conducted in a European language. The trade in the interior was conducted in indigenous African languages because the intermediaries, okay, the mulattoes or other people, the Tamamaos or the Lanzaros, they learn some languages of the interior and they could go and trade in those languages. So the European languages were needed just on the coast, where the commodities were brought from the interior. And now the negotiation transactions were taking at a larger level, at a more at a higher level, and now they needed the European language to communicate with the Europeans. Okay. And the Europeans, as they stayed on the fortifications, they probably learned some local languages too, just to make sense of what is going on in the environment. But we don't know much about that yet. Okay. There were longer idling times when people were waiting for winds to change directions before they could sail back. And the local women who had already been engaged in trade activities became more involved with the new trade system. And the mulatto children grew up bilingual and became powerful brokers, supplanting the Lanzados and the Tongamaos. Okay. And then, okay, next slide. We have to have a map. So this is a map that I showed you yesterday, where we have all these trade fortifications that emerged from this coast of South Asia, and then East Asia, Southeast Asia, and Asia, and in this area. And what is particularly interesting about this is that for instance, in Malaysia, there is a variety called Papia Kristen. So the way of the way that the speech or the language of the Christians. This is very revealing because in these fortifications, the native, the indigenous people that work with the Portuguese, they Christianized and they were acculturated to Portuguese manners. For them, they were becoming a new ethno-linguistic group operating in Portuguese. And some of them still consider themselves as Portuguese. There is such a group, for instance, in Sri Lanka, where people speak of the Burghers there, who speak Portuguese and who came to have Portuguese culture and so forth. So who are we to judge that this is not indigenized Portuguese culture? But this is the kind of thing that happened in this situation. And as I said yesterday, the colonies were walled communities surrounded by walls. In other words, you go by a particular gate to get in, by a particular gate to get out. And until now, these walls still exist, or at least what is left of the walls. And the people that live in those particular areas, they have this kind of identity. Okay. And since they live closely with the Portuguese that had settled there, not for plantations, but for trade. And there wasn't much multilingualism involved on the side of the indigenous populations. I don't see any reason why a Pidgin or a Creole would develop under those conditions. Okay. And I think that at least until the late or mid-18th century, mid-18th century or early 18th century, for some places, when the British, the Dutch, and the French confiscated the Portuguese colonies, there was no reason for these Portuguese varieties to diverge drastically from the European varieties or the colonial varieties that the Europeans spoke there in these colonies. However, once the Portuguese were driven out and the British or the Dutch or the French replaced them, now the dynamics of interaction have changed. Portuguese didn't bring the privileges that it had before during the British rule or the Dutch rule. And therefore, these people had to make adjustments. And they had also to consolidate their relationship with the other indigenous populations. And I think that is when substrate influence kicked in full force, making these varieties drastically different. I don't know, I don't speak Portuguese, so I'm not going to make a judgment. But they made these Portuguese varieties different from the European varieties. But if we speak of in terms of indigenization, what's new? Brazilian Portuguese has indigenized and is different from Peninsula or European Portuguese. Some Latin American varieties of Spanish have indigenized and are different from European varieties of Spanish. It's a matter of degree, and you have to bring in several factors to account for the structural distance between the indigenous variety and the European variety. And you have to look into the pointers that have formed into the colonies, which is actually what the indigenous population had been exposed to. So we have to approach these things with some sort of detachment from the prejudices of the 19th century that assume, hey, here you have non-European populations. They are different from us. their languages are structurally different from ours, and we consider them to be inferior people. Therefore, they cannot learn the European language faithfully. That's not really the way we should go. But as we said in the beginning, there were these small indigenous populations that went and lived with the European populations. And because the advantages they were deriving, including protection from the Islamic law, because the Islamic law has spread in the region, and therefore it was good for them to pass from new Europeans or new Portuguese people. It didn't have to depend on race, but we linguists have turned it into a matter of race, and this is how we should go about it, and we can still explain substrate influence without really having to invoke a teaching first and then the teaching turn into a Creole. It just doesn't make sense. There is no real logic supporting that. And I have to reiterate, it does not mean that for initial learners there was no interlanguage, but you pass the interlanguage with practice and you become more familiar with the language you speak differently. Okay. And so we have the Dutch East India Company. The Dutch East India Company gave up on trading in Portuguese and decided to trade in Malay. And they would contribute to spreading Malay from Malaysia to Indonesia, because Indonesia was a Dutch colony. And chances are that the Arabs that traded in the area before have already contributed to the spread of Malay into these particular areas. These are things that we really have to investigate. Okay. So in this context, when the socioeconomic value of Portuguese was declining, it was even easier for people either to develop some sort of attrition in Portuguese if they really shift vigorously to the new acrolectal language, or because other members of the larger community became interested in learning that Portuguese, then there are substrate elements that spread. But the fact that Portuguese was no longer the acrolect in the region should help us explain the divergence of these Portuguese varieties in the same way as we can explain the divergence of Latin in the provinces of the Roman Empire after the Romans had left the Western Roman Empire to protect Rome. Okay. And this is the network of Chinese trade in the area before the Europeans got there. And the Chinese traded in Malay, not in Chinese. Okay. And they formed their own communities, which eventually would function as intermediaries between Europeans and the indigenous populations. And they are the ones that learn English first, or Dutch first, depending on the place. And eventually they contributed also to the rise of Eurasians people. And the Eurasians are the people that were born out of unions between European men and indigenous women. And their children were bilingual in the European language and the indigenous languages, or became speakers, dominant speakers of European languages, and they are the ones that would also contribute to the spread of that. But in the meantime, the locally born Chinese in this part of the world, they became also a special ethnic Chinese group known as the Peranakans. and that is the group of Chinese that rule in Singapore today. Okay. They were important brokers. They took advantage of the situation, and once the regions became independent, Malaysia didn't want to include Singapore because it was swampy land and so forth. And these guys worked very hard, and they built the Singapore that we know today, and they are the rulers. And things that have emerged there include Baba Malay. Baba is the group of male Peranakans, and they are the ones that were engaged in the trade. And the Malay that they use has become different. And the Peranakans, in part, they also originally they married local women. But once they reached a critical mass, they became a closing community. And they gave up Chinese, they spoke Malay until the Europeans arrived, and then they would shift to the European language as the dominant language. The women, they call them Nyonya. And if you go to the region, I encourage you to eat Nyonya cuisine. It's an interesting blend of Malay and Chinese cuisine, and it's very, very delicious. Okay. So, this is part of the history in the region. So a number of things that will happen shouldn't surprise us because there were precedents for these kinds of things. So the one thing that we don't have a precedent for is Tijanized or Creolized Arabic variety, because the Arabs had traded in indigenous languages of the area, and Arabic remained the language of religion and a vernacular only among the Arabs. So it's really an interesting history where we have to get into a number of details in order to make sense of that. And one question that should arise is, well, the southern tip of Africa was also colonized, first by the Portuguese, and then the Dutch drove the Portuguese out. And the Dutch East India Company, in the place that has now become Cape Town, and was brought that there was the Cape of Good Hope, which is not really Cape Town, and it became the way station where the Dutch could come and recover from long trips or receive health care if they had fallen sick and couldn't be treated in the other colonies, or they just came to on vacation and they had relationships with the Khoisan women. And the interesting thing is that no pigeon emerged in this particular setting. Nobody speaks of a Dutch pigeon that emerged under these conditions. There is a variety of Afrikaans called Kaats Afrikaans, and but it's also spoken by the colored people, most of whom are people that were brought from Malaysia as slaves to work in South Africa. And they developed this variety that is different from the variety of Afrikaans that is Dutch, spoken by heritage speakers. It is different because of segregation, because the Dutch and the colored people didn't mix, and we know the history of apartheid that just intensified segregation among the populations in South Africa. So the title Wine, Women, and Good Hope, which actually inspired me for the title of this talk. Well, if you put your hand on the book, read it, you'll find out that colonization had this social dimension that is generally overlooked, and you don't have to see it just in terms of dominance, one population dominating another. You have to see it also in terms of the dominant population that is in economic power and in politics, but not necessarily demographically. That colonizing power the colonizing population had to adapt to the local economy, to the local culture. And the Cape of Good Hope was founded so that people could buy food from the Khoisan population before continuing to India, so that people can find fresh water and put it on the caravel ship and continue the trip and so forth, so that people can relax. Okay. But interestingly, just like the other contact centers that had emerged along the coast of Africa, we don't find any evidence of a Haitian that developed there, any evidence of a Creole that developed there until the plantation settlement colonies were developed on the islands around Africa, but not in coastal Africa. Okay. Well, there is a variety called Creole in Guinea-Bissau, but it's debatable whether that Creole developed locally or came there from Cape Verde. Okay. And then, but there too, there was really a close relationship between the Portuguese colonies and the indigenous populations, that communities, the ethno-linguistic groups that work with them. And you find a similar thing in southern Senegal, and that's where we find another Creole, the Creole of Casamance. Okay. But the question is, why do we call it a Creole? And that question must be answered. Is it enough to say it's Portuguese spoken by non-Europeans, by indigenous people, and it has diverged from European Portuguese, and therefore it must be a Creole? That's a poor analysis. We should come up with a better explanation than that. It's like claiming, and a number of people have done it, all the Romance languages are Creoles, or English itself as some sort of Creole. If you continue that way, given that the history of the world is a long history of mutual colonization, or one Homo sapiens group colonizing another Homo sapiens group and so forth, then there must have been several cases in the history of mankind marked by language shift and divergence from the language, the original language that became dominant in the colony. Then every language on earth must be called a Creole. And if every language on earth must be called a Creole, we don't need the term Creole. We have to choose between the term language and Creole, and that doesn't make much sense to me. Okay. So, why didn't a Portuguese patient develop at any of the Portugal's trade colonies? Okay. That's a very good question to ask. Okay. Why didn't a French pigeon develop in Africa? The varieties that have been identified as pigeon, like le Français tirailleur, was apparently fantasy fabricated by the French officers because they thought the Africans were too inferior mentally to learn French, and therefore they had to create a variety, since they wouldn't learn the many languages spoken by Africans that were recruited in the colonial infantry. And they thought they would fabricate a simplified pigeon-like variety of French. And when you see that variety, it's unlearnable. It's very difficult. They make things much more difficult for learning a language by immersion than anything. And so the variety never took off. It's in the imagination of the French, but there is no evidence that the Français tirailleur really existed and was used in the French army. And eventually the French themselves gave it up and used indigenous languages. And the officers, of course, were trained in French and they would function as colonial auxiliaries, so that the elite. And then there's another variety, La Bijane, and that variety emerged in the 20th century, and I said earlier, it's people that attended very little school but needed a lingua franca to talk among themselves in the city of Abidjan. And that is what we call Abidjan is non-standard, of course. And in Asia, we have a variety that developed in Indochina, Thai boy. So spoken by the domestics that worked with the French in the 19th century. But since that colony actually didn't last, the French lost control of it quite early. Thai boy died too. Okay. And then we don't have evidence of Dutch pigeons, so we don't have evidence of French pigeon, Portuguese pigeon. So the vast majority of the pigeons lexified by European languages are English pigeons. Are the English pigeons a peculiarity of English colonization? We have to look into that. Why didn't a Dutch pigeon develop in Nigeria or Cameroon, where the Dutch had also traded? Why didn't an English pigeon develop in India? In part because largely Portuguese functioned as the lingua franca of trade along the African coast and in the South Asia coast until Portuguese was replaced by these other colonial languages. But also because even the British East India Company thought it was smarter to trade in indigenous languages. And they thought they could use, the Asians could use Arabic or could use Persian until the Asians arrived in India and realized that the population there didn't speak Arabic as their vernaculars or lingua franca. They didn't speak Persian because these are the languages of the elite class. And so the Asians learned the local languages to work for the company. It would take until 1835 when Thomas Babington Macaulay wrote the minutes on Indian education. And this recommendation was to teach English to a small class of Indians, typically the children of the indigenous ruling class. They would receive education, you empower them. And these children would become intercolonial auxiliaries, interfacing between the masses of the population that had no need for English and the colonial administrators that couldn't learn the indigenous language. And this kind of privilege was very common in the colonies. The first people to receive education in Africa too were children of the ruling class, part of the bribery to turn them into agents of colonization. Okay. My parents benefited from that because I come from a family of traditional chiefs. And my parents were given education at a primary school level. And they then understood the significance of formal education and how it could empower people. And they put me in school and made sure that I could get the best education that I could. And look where I am. Okay. And many people of my generation didn't have the same kind of privilege that I did. And actually, I was thinking about a month ago, uh, the people from my village that became quite successful, you count them on your hand. And they are all related to my extended family, the family of chiefs. These are the people that got education early. There are many people that got education later, but the value of education was no longer the same as during the colonial period and the privileges that people could gain. So this is what's significant. Okay. So that would answer the question of why didn't a pidgin English develop in India? Okay. And what are the conditions under which Chinese pidgin English developed? And as I said yesterday, it was not in the major trade uh, interactions that we talk about, because those interactions were through brokers, the people that were trained in the language of the trade. It, Chinese pidgin English developed where there was parallel economy developing. And for food, for sex, for alcohol, and things like that, when the agents of the British East India Company were waiting for the wind, the direction of the winds to change before they can travel back to Europe. Okay. So this South and South Asian Portuguese Creoles really developed while the Portuguese traded in the region, or did they develop their indigenized structures under the British East India Company and British colonization? I'm insisting on the British because the British, took control of India, and they took control of Malaysia. Uh, and this is something that we have to keep in mind. What about Macau's Portuguese Creole? Or is it a case that what happened, although the Portuguese kept it as a dominion until the 20th century, there must have been something in the structure that made this Portuguese different. And I think that the differentiation must have amplified since after the Portuguese left. But I have nothing, this is just speculation. And this is there to say the people working on this variety should be giving us more information. So absence of evidence may be evidence of absence. So in 1992, Dillard said he had proof that the West African English pidgin had developed. But the proof for it, he found it in the United States and not in Africa. And then he came up with these things that he got from the records. And I had to move my microphone. And we never see our mothers anymore. Well, Irish varieties of English have often the bilabial fricative for the. So never. And of course it's spelled like never. And mothers, well, what people call fricative stopping, the, and we pronounce it as the, something that we non-native speakers do quite often. But is this a broken language? That's the question. By and by you die, and you go to the bad place, and after a while, calf die, and go and knock at the good gate. That is sounded as a broken language. And what I want to show is that these citations are closer to the European language than the other utterances that I'm going to show later, collected in the region. In Africa, that is Nigeria, and Cameroon, and they are harder to understand. Okay. I'm going to skip the thing about lingua de preto, and I think Anthony Nato had already given us a taste of that and said it was stereotypical and it was applied to all foreign talk, foreign talk. And so it may not be a peculiarity of Africans and we don't have to dwell on that. Okay, but to help the late Joe Dillard, now with the internet you can find a lot of things. And I don't know what words I had to use for my search. And I stumbled on this text by, I think it's John Matthews. He was a colonial officer, a British colonial officer. And it's here in the text. Well, my friend, you got trade today? You got plenty of slaves? No, we not got trade yet. By and by, trade come, you can't go. What you go for cash people? You go for make war. In order to understand this, you have to know that there are English non-standard dialects that you use for when we use to. So I want for go, or I want for to go. Okay. And you have two of them, they are redundant, people just choose for, so I don't see why it is necessarily a broken language. Yes, my brother gone for cash people, or they gone for make war. Okay. And compare it to the following examples of modern pidgin English. Okay, I'm going to imitate the accent, I'm not a speaker of these pidgins. Now, so I've been done to tell you. Okay. Somebody has to translate this for you to understand, even if you speak English. Okay. You know, see how the title rough like sandpaper for Maud? Dr. Chief Mrs. Ino Cassetto. Okay. You see waiting at the top? How many Minister Fit answered, sir, to any Tom, Dick, and Harry? Where senior them for age. The words are English, the grammar is really significantly different. And my theory is the earlier varieties of European languages spoken in Africa were closer approximations of the European languages than the later varieties. That's my hypothesis of divergence. And for Creoles too, where Creoles emerged, is the same story. They started from closer approximations of European languages, and then as the plantation grew bigger and residential segregation was set in place, the variety became more and more different. That's what the late Robert Chodanson in France called basilicalization, and my friend Emma Cabot tells me, no, let's dump the term basilicalization, let's be more neutral and decolonial, let's just speak of divergence. And that's the same story. Okay. It is in the 17th century that England, France, and Holland joined Portugal and Spain in colonial ventures that would eventually transform much of the world into Anglophone, Francophone, Hispanophone, Lusophone, and Creolephone colonies. There is something very colonial here. The Creolephone colonies capture the picture because the vast majority of the population where Creoles are spoken speak Creole. But Anglophone Africa, when only 20 to 30% of Africans in these colonies speak English in an acceptable way. Francophone Africa. So the maps that paint different colors for different countries, they are telling us lies of convenience for people that want to exercise power and kind of obliterate the multitude of indigenous languages that are spoken there. Francophone Africa doesn't mean the same thing as Francophone America. Portuguese Africa doesn't mean the same thing as Portuguese Brazil. Where in Brazil, Portuguese functions as a vernacular, in Africa, Portuguese functions as a lingua franca. So there's a difference. Okay. And you must have noted differences between African speaking Portuguese here in Brazil and you guys, native speakers speaking Brazilian Portuguese. In a way, European and African contacts in the 15th through the 18th centuries somewhat conjure up today's style of global trade networks or partnership involving African rulers and European entrepreneurs connected by the brokers. African kings and chiefs didn't lose control of things, and relations remained relatively egalitarian with Europeans until the 19th century, when the trade colonies would turn into exploitation colonies. And Europeans used some sorts of strategies to gain the trust of African leaders, promising to protect them and giving them some privileges, like sending the children to school to get partaking in the power, while in fact they were eroding the power of African rulers and taking lands away from them to control them. And now Europeans could also go into the interior and put the Asians in place to colonize Africa, same thing in Asia and so forth. Okay. While Portuguese play an important role on the coast, the Tandamaus, the Fatos or Lançados, the Sinhara and Nyara, and the children acting as intermediaries also use African languages. So what is interesting here, the European languages until the 20th century for that matter were confined to the coast and would penetrate into the interior only during the exploitation, colonization, through the Asians that would become colonial auxiliaries. Okay. And that means that before that period, people didn't need a European language to conduct trade in the African interior or in the Indian interior or wherever it was, because they didn't even go there, they remained on the coast. And the indigenous people that went into the interior, they didn't need Portuguese or they didn't need English and so forth. They needed major languages that were spoken in the interior in order to conduct trade in the interior. And this will explain why Pidgins didn't really develop in this particular kind of trade network. Africa was then part of a worldwide globalized network in which its rulers engaged as equal partners, so to speak, in the triangular trade which ignores the route coming from Asia. And there I give you again another picture of the fleet, the institutions, the fleets, the institutions, and the map of Africa that is at the center of the global network of trade all the way to the early 20th century, and especially after Africa becomes independent, Africa moves to the marshes for lack of economic development. Okay. And here we get, this next map please. This is where people start speaking of Francophone Africa, Anglophone Africa, or Belgian Congo, Belgian Africa, and so forth. But it doesn't really tell you much about the dynamics of language use in the country. And this is the multitude of major ethno-linguistic groups that existed in Africa. It can get more crowded than this. Okay. But this is the representation of that. But things change in terms of these languages, English, French, and even here is French, but Belgian French, and Portuguese becoming important languages of administration, of governance, and they are called official languages. But nowhere in the picture do we see a position for preaching really, and I'm going to come to that. Outside the force, trade was conducted through interpreters and intermediaries. In Africa, the practice continued up to the early 20th century, even after trade colonies had evolved into exploitation colonies in the late 19th century, through reliance on colonial auxiliaries. Portuguese remained the language of trade and diplomacy until the late 18th century along the coast of Africa and all the way to Japan. In the Americas, trade with the natives was conducted in Native American languages like Tupi or Lingua Geral in Brazil, Quechua, in Peru, and part of Argentina, I think, and Chinook Jalon in the west coast, northwestern coast of the United States, and what in Canada. But the importance of these languages decreased with the expansion of settlement colonies and the marginalization of Americans from the new socioeconomic world order. Because settlement colonization came up with this cultural assimilation strategy. You want to participate in the new socioeconomic world order, you shift to the dominant language of colonization. So in the United States, you had to shift to English. In Brazil, you had to shift to Portuguese. And the first people to shift, well, here I have to be more careful. In the case of the United States and the Caribbean islands, it was the slaves who shifted first to the European colonial language. They didn't have a choice. But then with other immigrants, you see the Europeans that shift first to the dominant language. What happened to Native Americans? They have been relegated to reservations. And when reservations become economically unsustainable, Native Americans come out and want to join European Americans, if I can designate them this way, in the urban centers or on the farms where they can find employment. And then they need the European language to function in a socio-economic world order. And this is when we start talking about the endangerment and loss of indigenous languages. That's the picture. And here in Brazil, what you notice, and I'll come back to this next week, the penetration of the Amazon is actually one of the factors that make linguists so much aware of language and endangerment and loss. Because with the penetration of the Amazon by so-called Brazilians, as the indigenous people were not Brazilians, you destroy the ecology, which affects the vitality of the population. The environment becomes less sustainable for the people, for the indigenous people. The indigenous people have to move or be further marginalized in pockets of areas in the rainforest, and they can keep the languages. Or the other choice is you acculturate to the dominant system, just like the Europeans have done it. Native Americans are doing the same thing. And beware of those people that tell you Native Americans are losing their languages because they have lost pride in their heritage. These people have a lot of pride and are fighting for their heritage. But the ecologies are not conducive to the maintenance of these languages. Okay. So Um, yeah, I have to use my arrow here. So, but the other thing that we notice is that in that big network of long distance trade, of global trade, in the Pacific there was another story. Pacific Islanders had been in migrations across islands, and they had developed, according to Emmanuel Drexel, maritime Polynesian pigeon. And when the Europeans went there in the 19th century for trade or to develop plantation colonies, but with not settlement plantation colonies, uh, but especially during the trade in the early 19th century, it was a three-way system of interpretation, a chain interpretation, from a European language to maritime Polynesian pidgin, and then to the indigenous languages, until eventually, by the late 19th century, the pidgin that was studied in the middle of the 19th century, the English pidgin started emerging in the Pacific. And so this needs attention. And I have been collecting books that talk about interpreters during the trade. I started with a handful of books. Now I have dozens of books that give a lot of information. And it looks like the more we understand the history of these regions as narrated by economic historians, the more I feel we have to revise our accounts of the emergence of pigeons, of creoles and pigeons. Okay. So colonial history doesn't support the traditional position according to which pigeons lexified by European languages emerged early in the contact between Europeans and non-Europeans. None appears to have emerged before the 19th century. Creoles had emerged already by then. They were started emerging really in the early 18th century. Yeah, early 18th century. And they started also as closer approximations of the European lexifiers, and in time they would become more and more different thanks to segregation. And Creoles didn't emerge from erstwhile pigeons because at best they emerged in parallel, or as it seems evident, they developed much later than Creoles. And the scarcity of pidgin lexified by other European languages suggests that pidginization was an English peculiarity, but we have to explain that. Tailleboy was short-lived in the 19th century. The Français tirailleur was concocted by the French colonists and hardly took off. And La Bichane is a 20th century phenomenon. These are the only French so-called pigeons that I know. So that's quite interesting. The available evidence suggests that even pigeons evolved by basilicalization, okay, divergent away from the European lexifiers. Present-day pigeons do not necessarily exhibit more complex structures than the 18th century approximations of the lexifiers. Let me make sense of this. Okay, they are more difficult to understand, and even for those more familiar with the lexifier. What I want to say here, what happens is a phenomenon that I call typological realignment. So you shift from some typological, from structures of a certain typological category to structures of a different typological category. Okay. And that is why they also become more difficult to understand, even though for those who are familiar with their lexifiers. In this respect, they are like creoles, which have become structurally more divergent from the lexifiers, also by the same process of typological realignment, not by simplification. Okay. They differ from related creoles in that they bear more substrate. I mean, the Pidgins differ from related creoles in terms of lexifying language, in that they bear more substrate influence, even lexically, from local substrate languages. The singularity of Nigerian and Cameroon Pidgin Englishes lies in the fact that they didn't really start it as broken languages either. Nigerian Pidgin and Cameroon Pidgin English do have sister varieties in Ghana and in Equatorial Guinea on the island of Yoko. They are all offshoots of Sierra Leone Creole. And the Creoles of Sierra Leone are people that went back to Africa, originating mostly from Jamaica, transited in Canada, and then went back, were affiliated there by the British after the American Revolution, okay, and mostly in the early I have to start counting here, 18th century. They went there, but in the late 18th century. And when the exploitation, colonization of Africa, they represented a group of English speakers that could be used by the British as colonial auxiliaries. But they also were very much engaged in trade along the Atlantic Ocean. And they took Creole with them where they went. So you see the setting, the colonial setting, where people need colonial auxiliaries. And here there are black people that seem to be speaking the European language. And why don't we call Creole a European language? And they take them as models. And the locals learn Creole. And this is how Creole spread from Ghana to all the way to Cameroon, present-day Cameroon. Then it became very strong, especially in Nigeria and Cameroon, and we speak of Nigerian Pidgin English and Cameroon Pidgin English. But this is not consistent with the traditional account according to which the Europeans arrived, and out of the initial contacts with non-Europeans, the Pidgin emerged, and then the Pidgin will become more complicated and become an expanded Pidgin. These are the different stories, where the locals are interested in the language of the foreign Africans from Sierra Leone that live with them, and they learn Creole, and the Creole is indigenized, and Creole becomes what we call Nigerian Pidgin English. And the other part of the story is that the German Baptist missionaries also brought missionaries from Sierra Leone, and missionaries can have a lot of influence in the evolution of their language, and that's true. And there are also Jamaican missionaries that came there in the 19th century. So, what is the bottom line? No one that did that couldn't find evidence of this putative West African Pidgin English before the 19th century. Okay, and West African Pidgin Englishes emerged in the 19th century as offshoots of Sierra Leone Creole, which had emerged a century earlier as an offshoot of Jamaican Creole. And contrary to Hancock, there couldn't have been a Guinea Coast Creole English along the Senegambian littoral, which spread southwards since the early 17th century. And the reason is because the trade language of Africa on the coast was Portuguese and not English. Okay. Actually, the Senegambia littoral is where Guinea's Creole and Casamance evolved, although Creole may be an offshoot of Caribbean Creole. Besides, Guinea Coast Creole English couldn't possibly have developed in the second half of the 16th century, contrary to what Hancock claims, because the English were not in the picture yet. The English gets in the picture in the 17th century, early 17th century, not in the 16th century. Okay. Hancock cites evidence of a Guinea Coast Creole English from Bolingbroke must have been seen that white men in the country, in the town where we live. He didn't come there one night for sleep, one blacksmith, countryman, and so forth. But the text sounds very English. It's not broken English. Okay. It's non-native English. We have to accept that. Okay. So if Nigerian Pidgin English and Cameroon Pidgin English are 19th century developments, and Caribbean Creoles had already emerged by the late 18th century, if not earlier, it is hard to sustain the long-held position that Creoles emerged from Pidgin ancestors, whose evidence was to be found on the west coast of Africa, and on the west coast of Africa we don't find any evidence of this. The current pattern of the distribution of European lexified Creoles and expanded Pidgins around the world reflects a particular history of trade and settlement colonization, as well as the development of the plantation industry. Okay. So I'm close to the end. Note or recall that the term Creole, that I didn't take in this story, the term Creole emerged in the 16th century, and the term Pidgin in the early 19th century, at opposite extremes of the world map. The term Creole developed in the Americas in reference to non-indigenous populations that were born in the Americas. So it varies. Sometimes the emphasis is on blacks, sometimes the emphasis is on whites. But the term Pidgin evolved from business English. Actually, there is a phrase in Chinese, in Cantonese, that Peichin or Beijing, whatever, it means pay money. And this may be one of the contributors to the transformation of business into Pidgin. Okay. And this was in Guangzhou. Different times, different parts of the world. It's not evident that Asian Portuguese and Spanish varieties labeled by linguists as Creoles should be so identified. I think it's driven by the race of the speakers, and we should really revisit this. They didn't emerge under the same conditions as those associated with plantation industry or enslaved or contract laborers. Nor are they marked by rapid population replacement, which happened in plantation settlement colonies. To date, nobody has produced a set of structural features that are uniquely Creole. Every time I see one of those features, I can say, well, you find it in the core languages of West Africa, or you find the feature in Chinese and things like that. But also when you pay attention, You find some of the same features in non-standard varieties of the European languages. So my conclusion, the received doctrine reveals what Michel de Graaf has characterized as Creole exceptionalism. It also reflects race-based biases inherited from the 19th century, which uncritically explain things in ways consistent with the alleged evolutionary inferiority and backwardness of non-Europeans. You will also remember that linguistics was born in the late 19th century, part of historical linguistics, and we have creolistic because the people that did historical linguistics or kinetic linguistics at the time thought that Creoles and Pidgins were unusual in arising from language contact, as if the Romance languages didn't arise from language contact, as if English didn't arise from language contact, and so forth and so forth. Okay. So these are things that we have to bear in mind. And my lesson is from Bob Marley, emancipate yourself from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our minds. Thank you very much.
So questions, comments?
Don't be too shy. You can challenge me too.
Thank you so much for more inspiring lecture with us. It's really interesting how you subvert the way you tend to think about European languages. When you talk about the contact between European languages and African languages, you're saying that it would be easier maybe to speak a European language because then it would be challenging to learn so many diverse languages spoken in the African continent. And this is really important for us to know this, and to realize this, because sometimes we take it for granted and stick to this idea of the superiority of the European languages. And it really says a lot about this lack of multilingualism in the European countries, and that is so common, this plurilingualism in the African countries. So this is really important, especially, I'd say for me, I'm not in the field of linguistics. I didn't grow up actually in this applied linguistics, so I think a lot about teaching. And I think your words, your reflections are highly important for us to rethink the way we conceive of language teaching. Because we tend to teach languages as if they were deprived of this diversity, of these varieties, of all this, the coexistence of other languages too, in the places where the European languages that we teach are spoken. So it's really important to have this awareness. And I really thank you for subverting these paradigms we tend to have when we think about European languages. So, and on this regard, I'd also say that when you think about this monolingualism, which is part of the way we split the world into Portuguese-speaking countries, Spanish-speaking countries, as if there weren't other languages there. I think it also made us act in a way as if we only needed to learn European languages. So I wanted to underscore the importance of having you discuss all these brilliant reflections with us to make us see that it's highly necessary to think about diverse languages when you think about learning languages, and not only stick to the European languages. Well, this is the first, and then I really appreciate to hear more. I think that's something that you might tackle in other days with us here, during the course about how this monolingualism, right? Even when we try to be bilingual, when you think about bilingualism, we think about English, learning English only, and how this affects the possibility of spread of having more languages being spoken as lingua franca, right? And not only the European languages.
Yeah.
So this is the first thing. Another thing is about when you said about when you wrote that the absence of evidence may be evidence of absence. And I really like the way that you used a modal verb, maybe the evidence of absence. But I was also thinking that maybe this lack of evidence, maybe lack of importance even to maybe some pigeons that were spoken here.
Yeah.
Because we really tend to deny or ignore what we don't want to see or what we want to see in order to prove our hypothesis, I wouldn't say hypothesis, I don't know this word, but our conceptions, right, that society previously engendered. And this is, yeah, and I really like the fact that you mentioned women, the role of women, also in the development of regional language development, because we're usually erased from the importance of all these processes. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much for your kind comments. And you obviously absorbed a lot from the wide range of information that I presented. I really take seriously the saying absence of evidence. Absence of evidence may be evidence of absence. Because I coined it because somebody wrote in reaction to a paper of mine in saying absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I wanted to turn into a positive because the same people that reacted this way to my paper when in 2020 I published a paper where I developed part of what I presented here. There is a much longer paper that is going to come out maybe next year that gives even much more information with citations and so forth. But the person told me, yes, there is evidence, I will present it. Well, we are in 2023 and the person hasn't shown me the evidence yet. And I don't know whether they were blushing and saying there is evidence, I will present it. But I'm still waiting for that evidence. And I think that in some cases, we start with ideas, they are speculations, and you hope that you will find evidence to support it. But there comes a point when you have to realize if the evidence is not appearing, maybe you were wrong. I myself, in the way that I present things, part of what I say is speculation. And I challenge the people working on specific areas to come up with counter evidence. Open-minded people among them are the people that often provide me even with more evidence that I didn't know about. And that can help in significant ways. The other thing that I want to underscore is that it's only in the 19th century that the Europeans came up with the idea of one nation, one language. And this was a consequence of the fact that the Bismarck, what I don't know, the Habsburg Empire, and Bismarck became an important man in all that. And when it disintegrated, and the different European nations emerged. And they needed some ways of distinguishing one territory from another. And they went into this policy of one mention one language. But they were doing violence to minority languages. And this is backfiring now because the minorities are fighting for the recognition of the languages that have survived and so forth. It doesn't really work. And in the context of Africa, I have come up with the term egalitarian multilingualism. And that means the populations that are living next to each other, they have respect for the neighbor's language. They are all at the same socioeconomic level. And no language has emerged as a kind of straight language that everybody had to speak if they want to speak with somebody else. The system that the Europeans introduced was helping communication between natives, indigenous people, and the Europeans, or between the elite, among the elite members of the indigenous population that came from different ethno-linguistic groups and functioned as colonial auxiliaries and we live in the urban environments. Otherwise, for the rest of the population, all languages have the same status. And you learn the language of the neighboring population that you are likely to interact frequently with. Or if you are moving and going to another place, you know that you have to learn the language in order to communicate with them. If they come from another place to your locality, they have to learn your language. There's not the kind of policy that the Europeans adopted them first for themselves in Europe and then transferred to the colonies, the settlement colonies were more or less the same thing here. But now that we are fighting for revitalizing endangered languages, things are going to change again, I hope. Okay. But as I said in one of my slides yesterday, we have to understand the causes of language endangerment and know what the real issues are, because solving those problems are key to revitalizing indigenous languages. And not just teaching them or writing grammars and dictionaries for them. That's not enough, because that's dealing with the surface of the wound and not really giving the right medication to heal the wound.
More questions? So none? Thank you all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
To tomorrow.